Hi, this is Sarit Switzer, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast, a podcast devoted to the teachings of Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi as recorded in his most famous work, the Tanya. My hope for this show is to make these teachings accessible and relatable to the average person, regardless of prior Jewish education or affiliation. The episodes follow the prescribed daily study portions and are meant to serve as practical lessons in how to live your life as your true self and develop an authentic and powerful relationship with your Creator. I have personally experienced the effects the study of this work has had on me, and I'm excited to share what I can of this knowledge with you. So please join me on this journey of learning, self-growth, and connection with your source. Hi, and welcome to the It Is Taught podcast. This is episode 394 for the 27th of Kislev in a regular year. Makeover shows. We've all seen them, or at least heard about them. And they're really popular, right? Whether it's about it's a show about making over someone's home, making over a restaurant, making over a room in a home, or most famously, and the type that I enjoy the most, is making over a person. So there was this show that I used to watch. I don't know if it's still around anymore, but it was called What Not to Wear. And the way the show would work is that it would be centered around a certain person who had actually been nominated for the show by friends and family who didn't dress very well, who usually they would pick somebody who dressed quite horrendously, in fact. And the friends and family of this person felt really bad because they felt like they really loved this person, and they felt that the clothing they were wearing was holding them back from getting a good job, making a good impression, maybe, finding a spouse or whatever it is. Some way they felt that the clothing that they were wearing wasn't really representing who they were as a person, and they wanted to change this. And so they would nominate them for the show. And then the hosts of the show, Stacy and Clinton, I believe their names were, would come, and it would be like a whole dramatic thing that they attack this person on the street, and they're like the fashion police, and they say, here, we're going to go and we're going to transform your whole wardrobe. And the whole show is all about that, going through their wardrobe, throwing things out, getting new clothes for them, figuring out their style. And it's a really transformative process. And while this might sound very superficial at first and like just a very vain kind of show, you actually see that it's not. And it's actually a very deep thing. And the people on the show who end up going through this transformation, it's not just an external transformation, it's an internal transformation as well. They end up having a lot more confidence. They end up feeling much better about themselves, much happier, just more real, more authentic. And you really see the power that clothing has. That this phrase that we say, clothing makes the man or clothing makes the woman, is a real thing. This is a true thing, that the clothing that you wear really creates who you are. It's not just a superficial thing that you wear. And this is what we're going to be talking about in today's episode. And we're actually going to be talking about it in a spiritual sense, that just like we have physical clothing, we actually have spiritual clothing too. And we'll see that what the spiritual clothing does for us on a spiritual level, and actually a physical level, I should say too, as we'll see, it has physical manifestations as well, is that it allows our souls, and specifically our godly souls, we're going to be talking about, which we defined what that is in the last few episodes of what the godly soul is, what the makeup of the godly soul is. So it allows our souls to express themselves in their authentic way and to thus become enveloped in godliness, which is their ultimate form of expression. So the way that you can think about it really is sort of like if you go to a restaurant and it's a very, very high-end restaurant and they only allow you in if you wear a suit or if you're dressed really nicely. So it's the same kind of thing. It's that in order for our souls to be able to access godliness in a full way, they need to be wearing the appropriate clothing in order to get there, in order to access that. So what are these clothes? What is this all about? And how does all of this work? So in short, and we're going to go through the Alter Rebbe's breakdown of all of this shortly, but in short, just to summarize, the basic idea is that we have three main soul garments. The three main soul garments that we have are thought, speech, and action. So what this means is that in order for the soul to express itself, specifically down here in this physical world, within the physical body that we're in, embodied within this physical body, it utilizes these three garments of thought, speech, and action. And each one of these garments expresses a different aspect of the soul. So if you recall from the previous 2 episodes where we gave the breakdown, the map of the soul, where with the 10 main attributes of the soul, each of these attributes becomes manifest through these different garments. So to be specific, when we use the garment of thought, the part of the soul that's being manifest at that moment is the part of the soul that relates to the intellect, the chabad of the soul, the 3 intellectual attributes of the soul. When we speak and when we act, use those other 2 garments of the soul, then the other faculties of the soul are manifest, namely what are called the midos of the soul, the emotions, the emotive aspects of the soul. And as we'll see, the way that this truly comes about, the way that this materializes, is through the performance of the mitzvahs. Because the mitzvahs that we have, we know that the Torah commandments are made up of 613 categories. Like there's 613 kind of basic mitzvahs, and then there's offshoots of those mitzvahs as well. But in general, the mitzvahs are divided up into 613. And then those 613 are subdivided into 2 categories. There's the 248 positive commandments, and then there's the 365 negative commandments, or in other words, prohibitions. And the 248 positive commandments, which relate to the 248 organs within our bodies, also correspond to the level of loving God. And the 365 negative commandments, which correspond to the 365 sinews within our bodies, correspond to the level of fear, the feelings of fear against God, like fear of going against God's will. And so thus we'll see how it is that all of our organs and sinews, namely basically every single part of our body, becomes attached to God by virtue of engaging in the commandments, which is a soul kind of endeavor, right? Because it's a spiritual thing to want to do the commandments. And the way that the soul does this, the way that the soul connects with the body in such a way, is through the garments of thought, speech, and action. So we can kind of think of these garments as being like an intermediary between the body and the soul, and the vehicle by which the soul, which is really spiritual in origin and doesn't really have like anything physical about it, but now that it's found here in this physical body, it's the way that the soul can now communicate with physicality and allow our bodies to connect with God, and can channel its faculties of, whether it's the intellectual faculties or if it's emotive faculties. It can channel these faculties in a true way that actually causes us to connect with God. So the way that Alter Rebbe explains this today, and for context, we're beginning chapter 4 of Likkutei Amarim, of the first part of the Tanya. So the Alter Rebbe says, so now we've discussed the basic makeup of the soul, the map of the soul, the different faculties of the soul, right? We spoke about that in the last couple of episodes. And so now, in addition to all of this, every godly soul also has 3 garments. What are the 3 garments? The 3 garments are thought, speech, and action of the 613 mitzvahs of the Torah. So in Hebrew, just to know the Hebrew terminology for that, so that's machshava is thought, dibur is speech, and maaseh is action. Okay, so now how does this relate to the 613 mitzvahs of the Torah? Why is it specific to the 613 mitzvahs of the Torah? So when a person actually does practically, like they're actively involved in the mitzvahs of the Torah, they're involved in the action garment of the soul. When a person speaks words of Torah, when a person's involved in learning and speaking about the 613 mitzvahs and all of their halachas and laws, that is a person's engaged in the soul. The soul is now wearing the garment of speech. And then the thought garment becomes manifest when a person really tries to understand all the different aspects of the Torah on all its different levels. On the level of the pshat, remez, drash, and sod are the different levels of the Torah. Pshat is the simple level. Remez is like the hinted at level, the metaphorical or allegorical level. Drush is like the homiletical level, it's called, like sort of like the midrashim and the stories and all that. And sod is the Kabbalah, the deeper aspects of the Torah. So when we try to understand the Torah on all these different levels, this is our soul wearing the garment of thought. Okay, so now when we do this, when we utilize these, like when we put on this clothing, just like, okay, now you have this person that put on the suit, now they can get entered into the restaurant. What happens to us? So when we utilize these garments in this way to perform God's Torah, God's mitzvahs, then what happens is that the 613 organs of our soul, like our soul is made up of 613 organs, become vested within the 613 mitzvahs of the Torah. So we become like enveloped within these 613 mitzvahs of the Torah. And to be specific, the way that this works is that, okay, so we know that, like, as we spoke about before, we have this makeup of our soul that's kind of, the general map is there's 10 attributes. So we have the 3 intellectual attributes of Chochmah, Bina, and Das. So this Chochmah, Bina, and Das becomes vested within the understanding of the Torah when a person is involved in this deep learning of the Torah on all of these different levels, to the best of their ability and in accordance with the root source of their soul above. And then the midos of a person, their emotive qualities, like the Chesed, Gvura, Tiferet, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, and Malchus, these become vested mitzvahs of the Torah when a person is involved in learning about these mitzvahs in a speech way, and also when they're actively involved in these mitzvahs. Okay, so now another thing to point out is that when we talk about these mitzvahs, when we talk about Chesed, Gvura, Tiferet, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, and Malchus, these are all the emotive attributes. So there's 7 in total, but these 7 can kind of be thought of in a general sense. They kind of fall into 2 sides. There's the right side and there's the left side, and they all kind of like are rooted in 2 very general midos, 2 very general emotions. What are these kind of root emotions? Are the emotions of love and fear. Kind of like, in a way, we're going to talk about this later in the podcast, but there's kind of like this duality that exists throughout creation in our lives in a general sense of like moving towards something or moving away from something. It's like everything in our life. It's like, oh, do we want to move towards this thing? Do we want to move away from this thing? Do we like this thing? Do we not like this thing? There's that push-pull all the time. And that's sort of love and fear is like, are these 2 general categories. And all of the emotive attributes of the soul kind of fall under these subdivisions of love and fear. And when we think about this in terms of the mitzvahs, we can say that love is the root of all the 248 positive commandments, and fear is the root of the 365 negative commandments or prohibitions. So how is this? So basically, if you think about it, it's like, why do we keep positive commandments? Like, what would motivate a person to want to do any of the positive commandments, such as making a sukkah, for example, or performing a bris on your child? Why would you do these things? Ultimately, why the motivation for that is love of God. It's because you love God, so you want to do what God asks you to do, right? Just like if you have a mother or father that tells you to do something, and because you love them, you're going to obey them. You're going to do what they want you to do. On the other hand, the negative commandments, the prohibitions, they're rooted in fear, because why would you refrain from doing something that somebody tells you to do? It's because you fear them, because you're in awe of them. So similarly here too, our fear of God, or awe of God, we can call it, the yira of Hashem, is what prevents us from the transgressing any of the prohibitions. And when we recognize that really by doing the positive commandments, by doing these 248 positive commandments, this is the only way that we can really cleave to God. We're going to talk about this elsewhere in Tanya as well, that how do you connect with somebody that you really love is you do what they ask you to do. And we know that in fact, the 248 commandments are considered to be the organs of God, the organs of the King. So when we do God's 248 commandments, we're connecting with God on this very essential level. And similarly, too, when it comes to fear and the prohibitions, it's like, why did God prohibit these things? What are all these prohibitions about? These are things that God hates. These are things that go against the will of God, that God does not want us to do. So when we refrain from doing these things, we're gonna like, what's gonna stop us from doing these things is because we're feeling like a fear would be ashamed to do something that would make God unhappy. Like, again, think about like someone you love, a spouse, a partner, a parent, or whatever it is. If they really hate spiders or something like that, like, would you bring them spiders into their home? You know, like that would be a horrible thing to do. Like, why would you do that to someone that you love? So it's a similar kind of thing, that there's certain things that God hates, that even though, as we'll learn as we go further in the Tanya, everything comes from God. Everything really is godly and truly a manifestation of God. Nevertheless, God did create these things in the world called klipos and sitra achra that we started speaking about previously already. These are things that conceal godliness in the world, and there is a purpose for them, but really just on a simple, overt way, they conceal godliness. They don't manifest God in the world, and they prevent godliness from shining through. And so all the things that God prohibited from us are all in the realm of these klipos and sitra achra. So when a person, God forbid, engages in these things, it's like they're doing things that God hates. And so we don't want to do things God hates, right? And only are we doing things that God hates, but in fact, even more profoundly than that, in a way, is the fact that these klipos and sitra achra actually have no subsistence of their own. They don't have any vitality of their own. They have to suckle because like I said, since everything truly is godliness, anything that's not godliness, it's like, where does it gets its existence from? It has to get its existence, its substance from somewhere, from something holy. So when a person down here who is essentially holy, a Jew is holy in its root, but so when a Jew transgresses one of these negative prohibitions, what they're doing is they're basically creating this like opening for these klipos and these sitra achra to suckle from, which is pretty intense, right? Because this is exactly what God hates, and God does not want these things to have existence. So it's like we're feeding the spiders. we're not just like bringing the spiders to God, we're actually like feeding the spiders, which God hates. I mean, God doesn't hate spiders, but whatever, in terms of the analogy of whatever it is that God hates and the prohibitions of the Torah. So that's the end of the section for today. So once again, just to summarize it and bring it all together. So once again, clothing makes the man or woman. We know that. The makeover shows, all that kind of stuff. The clothing we wear really does allow us to shine through in a real way, in an authentic way, or in an inauthentic way, depending on the clothing that we wear. So in the case of our souls, in the case of our godly souls, the garments that it utilizes in order to manifest its true potential and its true self are the garments of thought, speech, and action. And the true potential of the godly soul, we know, is in terms of its attributes, which we know there's the intellectual attributes and then there's the emotive attributes. The intellectual attributes become manifest through the garment of thought, and the emotive attributes become manifest through the garments of speech and action. And the emotive attributes we can think of as being kind of at their core, at their basis, love and fear of God, which have a direct connection with the mitzvahs, because we know that there's 613 mitzvahs, which are divided into positive commandments, 248 positive commandments. And these 248 positive commandments, why do we do them? We do them because we love God, because we want to do God's will. And the 365 negative commandments, which correspond to the sinews within our souls, within our bodies, connect to the fear of God, connect to not wanting to go against God's will, not wanting to connect to things which are despicable to God. And so that's when we use these garments of the soul, the thought, speech, and action, in a way to really allow our souls to do the mitzvahs, then this causes us to really become connected to God in a very essential way in his attributes, his 248 organs and 365 sinews, that we become vested within him. So that's it for today, and we'll continue with this chapter and conclude this chapter tomorrow, and I will speak to you then. Thanks for listening to the It Is Taught podcast, hosted by Sarit Switzer. This podcast is dedicated in loving memory of my maternal grandfather, Avraham Yitzchak ben Binyamin HaKohen of blessed memory. Music by Shoshana. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the show, please share it with others and subscribe on YouTube, Apple iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And make sure to leave us a 5-star review. To find out more about the It Is Taught project, including more information on my soon-to-be published book, please visit our website, itistaught.com. To catch the latest from me, follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Looking forward to speaking with you tomorrow, and until then, have a great day.